That's one of the pieces that I think is missing from a lot of people who want to start sharing their story is they forget who they're sharing their story with. Because sometimes our egos get all caught up with like, I'm getting this visibility opportunity. I'm on this big podcast. Yeah, but you're on this big podcast with someone and for someone's audience. And that's a person that you can build a quality relationship with. And most people don't build relationships just off of business transactions.
All right, my friends, time is precious, right? The amount of time that we have is a measure of currency that is not promised to us. And, I want to do this one a little differently because I'm thinking about the fact that so many of us out there are trying to share our stories, share who we are, how we're showing up in the world, and hopefully we will touch, move, and inspire at least one person, right? That's kind of what the whole mission statement is for Holistically Speaking, is that I'm leaving you with tools to touch, move, and inspire you in some way to be a happy and healthy grown up, to turn those traumas into triumphs, right? Well, when I met my girlfriend, Kimberly Spencer, it definitely hit me that this is a girl with a message. She executes it well. And I just had to have you on the show, my dear friend, my queen, my communication queen, the girl who knows how to crown herself, the woman, rather, that knows how to crown herself. And we're going to talk about your latest book because that's really what I want you to dive into here. Because as a fellow queen of the podcasting space, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of books out there, obviously, that are talking about how to podcast, how to tell your story. But where I really resonated with this message is that you're not just telling people how to be a better podcaster, you're telling them how to be so radically interesting that you're going to want to interview yourself. And I think that even goes beyond the podcast space, right?
I think it totally does. I mean, it goes into using your message as a vehicle, using your life story as part of your personal brand, your visibility, and your way of service. Like when I did my TED Talk, the main theme, the one big idea was that your life is a testimony for possibility.
Mm.
And so no matter what you've been through in your life, when you are able to leverage both the pros and the cons, the traumas and the triumphs, as I've seen having coached leaders for 9 years now, a lot of them really struggle with celebrating their own achievements. And these are people that have reached number one in their industry. Like, and yet they're still struggling with receiving the celebration. And yet it's when you own both the pros and the cons, and you own that duality, that's when your story truly is able to serve, because people can see that if you can, they can too.
Oh, that's so powerful. And I think as women taking to the microphone, and that can be the podcast microphone or on stage or in front of a group of people or even a small, even your own family, where you're
Mhm.
leaving a powerful message, even with your children, right? Is so important that we execute that message well, like really get that message across in a very powerful way, but also one that makes sense. Because a lot of times there's people out there that have a message to share, but they're not sharing it well to where you really walk away with something.
Ability to share it well, and the ability to share it without the shame,
Mm,
because shame loves secrets. And so when we're able to do our healing work internally and heal through that, sometimes in the sharing of the story, it's the final pieces of healing that shame. Like I was shocked when we started our agency in early 2023. We beta tested it in 2022. And we started it because of the success I'd had having guest podcasting bring in over $250,000 for my coaching business, Crown Yourself. And I thought, well, I'm onto something. And so we started it. And as we're growing it, as we're getting more clients, I didn't realize that the agency itself would be a vehicle for personal transformation. That is an accomplishment that deserves to be owned, but sometimes it's hard to see our own successes because we're just kind of, especially for high achievers, because we kind of just plod through and we're just, oh, we did that and now for the next Everest because that's what we do, versus really owning, wow, yeah, I climbed that mountain.
yeah.
I accomplished that. I achieved that. I survived that. I'm really, really grateful, and having that ability to reflect.
Mm.
And when we can share the journey in a way that allows our audience, who is a lot of times they're where we were at the bottom of the valley, trying to climb up the mountain. And when we can let them know, hey, I was there, I've been there, I feel you, let me be your guide. That's not only how you build a powerful brand, that's how you convert listeners into clients, into raving fans, into people who will radically support your work because they're so excited to have someone who's pioneered a path for them.
Yeah, pioneered a path for them. I love that. And listen, coming from the world of mental health, right? And and being supported by a therapist when I was younger all the way up to adulthood, like therapy is so different now than it was then because
Mhm.
now we're seeing people who are coaching and providing therapeutic means kind of sharing their own journey in a way with healthy boundaries because you want to identify with that person that's holding space for you and makes you feel safe and be in a trusted space, right? It doesn't mean you have to unload everything, but there's something about the commonality and the connection and the collective of saying, hey, I've been through stuff. Kimberly, we're seeing this a lot, especially with people that are in the trauma space like me,
Mhm.
sharing their memoirs. I've had a number of them as guests on my show, sharing their story because even though they might be up there in the world of the trauma space or whatever else they do, they're human. We all have stuff. And you make a really powerful point there that it's sometimes nice to know, oh, this person's been there before and they've kind of paved that path for me.
And I think for the recovering perfectionists in the audience, myself included,
I'm with you.
yeah, that there's that idea and desire to be perfect.
Mm,
And one of the stories I share in the book is a very memorable moment for me when, because back in early days, like 2013, that was right after my first film as a screenwriter had just come out. I was still kind of in Hollywood, but still leaving and starting to, I had just become president of an e-commerce company. But I was still watching the Hollywood scene. And I remember seeing Jennifer Lawrence and Anne Hathaway on the Hollywood scene. And they're both, super talented actresses, both up for Academy Award nominations, both Academy Award winners that year. And the press fell in love with Jennifer
hmm,
Lawrence. And they were like, and there she was, like flipping off the camera, sharing how she was eating burgers. And, she just appeared really normal and human. And we're like, yeah, oh my gosh, she wears flip flops on the red carpet like I would, just because heels after, walking up and down stairs can sometimes hurt. And meanwhile, I don't know whether it was Anne Hathaway's press team or what, but she came off as this like poised Audrey Hepburn statuesque sort of old school movie star, and the press eviscerated her.
mm,
And this was such an astounding moment in studying human psychology and collective psychology, because why did we resonate with Jennifer Lawrence but hate on Anne Hathaway?
mhm,
And it was because Jennifer Lawrence came off as human, but Anne Hathaway came across as perfect.
mm,
And subconsciously, we know as humans, like I certainly know I have made a fair share of mistakes in life. And so I know I'm not perfect. And so anyone who's presenting or posturing as perfect, who doesn't flub a word, who doesn't express authentically what they're feeling or believing, that can come across unconsciously to an audience as like, what are they hiding? Like
mm.
what's really their truth? Like what's really going on in the background? And we see this in celebrities, we see this in politicians, we see this everywhere where there's that unconscious distrust for some reason and we don't know why.
And I mean, add social media to that. I mean, we live in a
Yes.
filter world. And I remember reading on your website that whole idea of not perfect enough, not smart enough, not working hard enough, not skinny enough, not lovable enough, right? We're equating everything to that idea of, well, when is enough anyway? Because once you have enough, you're like, but wait, there's more, you know? And so like I've been there too. I get it too. Like I'm such a perfectionist. I want things to be done, but where does that come from? Right? Where is that coming from?
Mhm.
The awareness that you have that means that you can change that if you want to change that. Now, I know you mentioned your book briefly. You just referenced your book a second ago, and I want to give our folks a chance to know what we're talking about because I had a chance to read this book before it came out. Thank you for the honor of doing that because it was exceptional. There's a lot of books out there in the podcast space. There's a lot of books out there that talk about how to write your story, execute your story. I loved Make Every Podcast Want You. Okay. This is a book that's dropping just in time for International Podcast Day. But again, I just want to stress that this is not just a book for podcasters. Okay. I didn't see it that way. This is a great book for podcasters because it's sharing with you how to get on the other shows because we already have our own audience, right? Sometimes we're so much focusing on our own audience, but they're already with us. You folks tuning in are already with me. You're my people. But how can you help me find more audiences to help you heal, right? That's really what it's about. And that's where you go with this book. But also, you really get really honest about your own story.
Yeah.
And since this podcast is all about turning traumas into triumphs, I would love for you to share a little bit more about how Kimberly came to this.
Well, Kimberly came to this growing up with entrepreneur parents. My dad was a very, very high functioning alcoholic and addict until the age of 30 when I staged his intervention in 2016. And his proudest accomplishment was that for the last 4 years of his life before he passed in 2021 was that he remained sober off of alcohol for the last 4 years of his life. So he got to have a relationship with my son. He got to have a relationship with me. That being said, the first 30 years of my life were rather challenging. If we were to look at the drama triangle, I was constantly either the challenger of behavior or I was the hero sweeping in to save him year after year. And that experience of sometimes being a parent at the ripe old age of 6 or 7 and calling out behavior that was inappropriate or wrong, it's a really challenging place to be in. And given that there were multiple forms of abuse in that situation, especially when my father was drinking. When he wasn't drinking, he was an amazing, generous, wonderful man. And it's funny with trauma, especially with, dealing with someone who's passed, many people have their memories of my father and they're positive. They're like, "Oh my gosh, this is amazing." In fact, he was a big YouTube star. Uh, yeah,
Late in the
crazy,
game.
right? Late in the game, like lifetime dream come true. But yeah, he was a big celebrity on a show called Elders React. And everybody, like the internet, wanted him to be their grandpa. And I can't watch a single episode because on most of those, I know he's drunk or high.
Mhm.
And it's a gut feeling. And for most people, they see it and they see, oh, he's gregarious, he's so funny, he's so bombastic. And my mom and I watched those and we're like cringing because we know. And sometimes I equate it to like kind of like those who have been in a war. I haven't, but from what I know of PTSD, that only the people that are really in it kind of can really identify that feeling. And so that was the challenge of growing up. Was outwardly everyone thought we had it pretty much together, great middle class family. And yeah, my dad was open with some of his struggles with alcoholism, but it wasn't that bad because he was so gregarious and fun. But behind closed doors there was a different person sometimes. And fast forward, that led me to put myself in relationships with men who didn't treat me right. I put myself in positions with that led to sexual assault and being raped. And I share about that in the book. And it took me actually, because that experience happened in 2012, a month before I met my husband. And it took me until 2018, 2019 to actually realize, because the unconscious mind represses unresolved
Mhm.
experiences until you're ready to process them. And it was at an experience, I was at this event that I had just, unbeknownst to me, saved someone's life because of my story. And on at this experience, it was one of those in-person live personal development events with one of my mentors. And Lewis Howes had just spoken and he shared his story of sexual assault. And so we were all gathering into these groups. And he said, okay, now you're going to gather into these groups and you're going to share what was something that you've been able to really be proud that you overcame, that you survived. And it was the first time publicly that I had shared. I didn't share it publicly on podcasts until after my father had passed because even though he said I could and wanted me to, I chose to not share about certain experiences until after he had passed, just because I know of the connotations. But it was the first time I shared that I had been sexually molested when I was a kid. I don't share about that in the book, but I shared it to this group, and in this group, there was one of my clients who had just gotten out of a narcissistic, abusive relationship. There was another gentleman who was a fellow coach, trauma informed as well, who had experienced sexual assault. And I see this guy, and I'm so grateful for this experience, because I see this guy out of the corner of my eye, and I'm like, he should be in our group. And my gut just knew. And I call him over, and as we're going around the circle, he's last. And I look at him as it becomes his turn, and I just know. And I'm like, he is going to bullshit. He is going to drop some bullshit sob story that's not even true. And I see him, and he catches my eye, and he looks down at the ground, and he shares truth. And he shares for the first time with anyone in decades that he had been raped as well.
Hmm.
And so me and the other coach, we ended up taking him out because, just to process that breakthrough and that experience. And I just remember after him processing that, and we kind of got to the other side of just allowing the body to somatically move through that experience, I called my dad and I said, I know you still feel guilt and shame. And this was once he was sober, and I had staged his intervention like 2 years prior. And I said, I know you still feel guilt and shame for what you did to me when I was a kid, but I think we just saved a life. And he didn't have any idea how to take that. And I said, I know this is going to sound really weird, but I'm really grateful for you and all the mistakes and all of the successes as well. We ended up hanging up. Fast forward a few years later, I'm stuck abroad in Australia. I'm pregnant. My father has just passed away in January of 2021. And I get on a call with this same guy. We had stayed in touch through Facebook. I had seen his smile brighten over his profile pictures, and we just were having a catch-up call. And he said, Kim, I want to let you know, you saved my life that day. And I was like, yeah. And he goes, no, Kim, I was planning my suicide for that night. And I said, well, I think you also saved my life too, because that night I woke up from a dream that was a full-fledged somatic memory of my own sexual assault that happened when I was in 2012. And I remembered every detail. And I even, like I share in the book, like I had to Google the definition of rape because I didn't want to call it that, because it wasn't like you see in the movies.
Yeah.
And I went on a podcast after that experience in 2018, and I shared about it. And I remember the host was like, wow, I guess you could say that I was too. And she had never acknowledged it because, again, for her, it wasn't bad enough.
Yeah. This goes back to what we were
So
talking about with
the enoughness.
downplaying as well. Like, oh, there's people that have far worse. There's people that have been through far worse than I have. But your experience is your experience.
Yeah.
And look how you touched, moved, and inspired somebody to still be here to this day. And trickled that down, because in some way what I'm hearing is it was a level of forgiveness with your dad. I mean, forgiveness is about us. It's not about the other person. But if that left him with one thing to remember as he left this earth, maybe that allowed him to forgive himself.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Yeah, that's my
powerful.
hope.
That's not in your book, but
It's not in the book.
which, you pick up a book about podcasting. You don't think you're not going to hear anything about that. But that's what I'm saying. Like, this book, Make Every Podcast Want You, How to Be So Radically Interesting You'll Barely Keep from Interviewing Yourself. As someone who works in the field of trauma, here's a lot of statistics. Is always looking for, to proof positive things with the science mind. You do give a lot of statistics that aren't so much about podcasting too. Like, you get into the neuroscience of some things as well, which I love. But you also give the statistics on how to be a better podcaster, be a better storyteller, and where we need to go when we're telling these kind of stories. right? Because
Yeah.
we're not necessarily always looking for, oh, I hope I make a buck from this. Hopefully not. But we are looking for a way, like you're telling your story as a way to heal. And I think that's
Mhm.
why we're seeing so many people, the increase in people at the podcast, Mike, especially women.
Mhm. And I think it's also the it's healing, yes, but I think the next level of forgiveness is
Oh,
service.
yes. Absolutely.
And
Yes.
when you can serve, not necessarily as being like, not necessarily does it have to be in an advocacy space, but it can be in just your own process of healing and of service and just sharing your story
Mm.
and allowing those parts of you to be witnessed.
Beautifully stated. Right. I think that's definitely the next level of life in general. If we're at that stage of awareness that it's not about us anymore, right? Now it's about how can I support? How can I serve? What can I leave this world with that I know that I've made some kind of a difference, right?
Yeah, and that's where the story comes into play.
Definitely.
And it comes with owning the successes and the great parts too.
Yeah.
You don't have to just focus on trauma. Like I had one an amazing question from a podcaster who was like, I don't have any like severe
Right. You don't have to have trauma,
trauma.
folks. You can just get to the mic and
She
talk about horror flicks if you want to.
I was like, "Well, what was something that was difficult?" She was like, "Well, I was a middle child." I said, "That comes with its own challenges."
Sure.
And just like the enoughness is just our ego swinging this pendulum from not enough accomplishments to not enough tragedy. And so when we can remedy our ego and let us know like our experiences are enough to share because there's somebody else who also is that middle child who didn't have a lot of trauma who's like, do I have anything valuable to say to anyone because I didn't have extreme trauma in my life? And that's something that is so important. I was working with a woman who was starting her coaching business and she was moving into and she'd been in the medical field for like 30 years. And she was like, Kim, why don't I just give you referrals? Like, why am I spending all this time building my business? And I was like, well, as much as I value referrals, like I don't, I, I'm not going to take them from a place of disempowerment. So I want to let you know there will be referrals that you may want to give me that may not want to work with me because I have certain lived experiences. I am of a certain age that for some who may be 30, 50, 40 years older than me, they may not think it's as like, what does this whippersnapper know? Versus my client who is an older woman, I said, well, they're going to value your lived experience because you're closer in age
Yeah.
or because you come from a medical background or because of these other experiences that you've had. So there will be people that will trust you more because of who you are in your own story. And that's why there's no such thing as competition in storytelling.
Oh,
Like
good
there's
gosh.
none.
Thank you for saying that. And the people that there and first of all, there are so many stages and so many microphones and so many ears to hear your voice. And even if you and I had almost the same exact experience, we're not internalizing the experience the same way, right?
Mhm.
So whether you have had something happen to you that is upsetting or traumatic, or maybe nothing happened to you, and you're just living life grand, awesome, but still that experience is yours. Nobody owns it. And nobody owns this real estate that's upstairs either. Like you're the only proprietary, imminent domain owner of what's going on in your head. So somebody else is going to see that message differently.
Yeah.
So I'm curious why you took it to, and by the way, thank you for sharing your story and being so open and vulnerable. And I know our listeners are going to be, it's going to, something you say will grab them in some way. It doesn't have to be the whole story, right? But
Yeah.
for this book that you have coming out, Make Every Podcast Want You. How to Be So Radically Interesting. You're barely keep from interviewing yourself. My favorite part of any book is usually the hook and it's the second line. So I love that part. Like being so like, yeah, I would be on Holistically Speaking if I could, right? But I'm curious how you came about writing this book. Like what made you want to write this and what makes it different?
What made me wanna write it was honestly the fact that in 2021 to 2023 was a very, very challenging ye
Mhm.
like, initiation is what I call it, of growth. We grew my company 300%. One year, we grew at 150% the next year for coaching, and I got pregnant, I gave birth to my son, like, free birthed him because my midwife wasn't even there. I lost my father, I lost my aunt, I lost my grandma, I lost 2 family friends within the span of a year. I moved countries, I moved states all in the span of 1 year, manifested our dream house, and then suddenly landed and was like my nervous system was like, "Fuck." Like, I don't know if I can curse on your show, but that was
I
really the
love
only word
that.
that's
I
appropriate.
always love when I get to add the E rating, quite frankly.
Oh, yes. And so that experience, I was finally settled, and we're in our home, and I'm looking at just having a lot of reflection because I got to have like one of the most important conversations that I had was a conversation with my aunt. She had a radical turn with breast cancer. It suddenly came back like that. Doctors said they'd never seen it spread so fast, and suddenly within a month she was gone. And I got to have a final conversation with her. I didn't get to have that with my dad. And I didn't get to have that with my grandma either.
Mhm.
But I got to have one with her. And I got to ask her all these questions about her life and some of the rumors that we had heard of, because she lived a different life. And so I got to, ask about the rumors, but I also got to ask about regret. And that's a conversation that I'm so grateful for because it has stuck with me for years. And I am so grateful to you, Auntie Joanne, because as I landed and was my nervous system was kind of coming back to a place of regulation,
Mhm.
quite frankly, after just being in go drive mode, that thought of regret of like, what if I didn't do, what would I die regretting? And I have had 3 half-written books, solo books. And now I'm a best-selling author from a multi-author book from years ago, but I've always wanted to write my own.
Yeah.
And I have 3 that have been sitting in the backlogs of a Scrivener file in my documents folder, just half done. And I looked at that and I looked at another book that I had when my son was really young and was scared of his own farts. And I looked at those. I said, if I don't release my children's book and if I don't release a solo written book, then I'm going to regret that. Like, that's what I would regret. And then I realized I'm 13 years away from 50. And I was like, oh, fuck no. So,
You're like,
so I was like,
tomorrow's
that's
never
not,
promised.
that was, that marker of 13 years away from 50 was like, whoa, okay, I know I've got about 13, at least 13 good books in me that I want to pump out. So let's see, let's play with this. So writing a book about podcasting, specifically guest podcasting, specifically about sharing your story and
Mhm.
guesting, it made sense from a business perspective because we were growing our agency from 2022 to 2023. We're still scaling, and so I couldn't make the business excuse of like, oh, this is not valuable to my business, or this is no longer. I was like, no, this is valuable to my business for one. So I had to make it a non-negotiable as like a smart business decision.
Mhm.
And I also knew that I was not going to go another year with having a book unpublished or half done. And it almost happened again, Hill. Like, it almost happened again. It was, where was it? I was April of 2024. I had a half done book, half done, and I had an early miscarriage.
Mm.
And I am so grateful to that little soul because that was a wake up call of wake up calls where that little soul showed me, do you want to keep continuing some habits or do you want to actually like stick with this commitment? And
Hmm.
that was such a wake up call. It put me on 75 hard. And from 75 hard, I had this intuitive hit to book a cabin. I booked a tiny home for a week, told my husband, said, you're taking the babies for a week with my mom, and I'm going to finish this book. And I gave myself 4 days and I banged out 120,000 words
Wow.
in 4 days. And the book ended up being 500 pages long,
I was trying to do the math
which,
in my head because the average is like 2,500 per chapter.
yes.
Wow.
Yes, and I am great. It was the podcasting Bible. It was the absolute guest podcasting Bible, and I am so grateful to my editor, Krista Huber, for being the dietitian of dialogue and the personal trainer of prose to like condense it into a digestible work that that can serve someone who is not obsessed with podcasting.
What incredible. All right. So before we go any further, I just want to say if you are loving this conversation, or a podcast or somebody with a story that has to be shared, and you're writing your book and get it done, and I'm talking to myself right now with that, Kimberly, because I've got the proposal done. I've submitted it. It's even won some honorable
Mhm.
mentions. Get the crap done. But if this is you in any way whatsoever, pay it forward. Share this podcast episode. If you're loving it enough, and I know you are, give it a like, a follow, subscribe to this podcast on Holistically Speaking, and leave some kind remarks and a review and rating so other people can find it. That's what I always ask. But also, I will put in the podcast notes this book, Make Every Podcast Want You: How to Be So Radically Interesting You'll Barely Keep from Interviewing Yourself. P.S. All, I got an early copy of this book. Kimberly graciously gave it to me to read. I loved it, which is why I was like, get your butt on my show. Okay. So we're going to share that in the links of this podcast. I love this conversation. You and I shared an Uber for like 40 minutes going to the airport in Orlando after Podfest. And I'm like, I need
Yes.
this woman in my life.
Same. I mean, and all we talked about was concerts and like nothing about podcasting. And I think that's one of the pieces that I think is missing from a lot of people who want to start sharing their story is they forget who they're sharing their story with.
Mhm.
Because sometimes our egos get all caught up with like, I'm getting this visibility opportunity. I'm on this big podcast. Yeah, but you're on this big podcast with someone and for someone's audience.
Mhm.
And that's a person that you can build a quality relationship with. And most people don't build relationships just off of business transactions.
True. That's very true. You know? And by the way, there's one quote that I love more than anything, and it's just a real reminder. It's like, you never want to be the richest person in the cemetery. Like, are you taking it all with you, my friend? Are you really? Like, who cares how big your
Yeah.
mausoleum is, right? Like,
Yeah.
I'm not saying give it all away, but like pieces of you are meant to be shared, right? And you share so beautifully in this book. Would you consider this kind of like a teaching memoir?
Kind of. I mean, I don't really consider it a memoir, but I naturally just kind of go into stories anyways. So there's lots of stories and
Yeah,
examples within the book because we learn through stories. And so
we do.
I like to demonstrate the principles by sharing stories like the story of the Blarney Stone or the story
That's
of
good.
um,
That's good.
of just being able to, share how certain podcasts that we've got our clients on have been able to amplify their reach and their brand and like the strategy behind different businesses so that there can be multiple examples so that nobody can read this book and be like, oh, I don't know if this will work for me. Like you'll be able to read this book and you'll find an example and say, okay, yeah, I can do, if they can do this, I can too.
Yeah.
And I can get booked. I can share my story. I can leverage guest podcasting if you want to leverage it for your business or if you just want to leverage it to have quality conversations and build your relationships in a way and build your message and your impact with others.
Yeah, and be an authority, right? I mean, for me,
Mhm.
originally when I started this podcast, and look, I've been in the media space for over 30 years. I started out as a young news anchor reporter, and I've never left this microphone or the camera behind. But I wound up going into the trauma space too. But I realized that my superpowers are my connection to others and my voice. And if I'm going to share information, I'm going to share it the way I want to, not guided by some like mainstream media like I used to work for, but how can I share a message in a way that it will leave something with someone else, right? That too is currency, right? But then you move into
Mhm.
the space like, if you want to make money off your podcast or on the stage speaking, like all these things can come to you. It just depends on know your message and know what your purpose is. That's big too, knowing your
And
purpose.
and knowing your purpose and knowing who you're speaking to,
Oh, yeah,
because
know your audience. Sure.
being able to have that adaptability and flexibility with your
Yeah.
communication to leverage, like, not every podcast I go on do I share trauma
Mhm.
stories or share those experiences, because sometimes, like I share in the book, like, sometimes people actually aren't ready to be in to hold space for that.
Yeah.
And you, as a communicator, as a storyteller, need to understand and have the diversity of communication to kind of feel out, is this a space where anything is open,
Mhm.
or like, or am I going to tailor certain parts of my message, not not being authentic to
Yeah.
you, but being respectful of the other person's space of what their capacity is at this moment.
Absolutely. Really, you've got to read your audience and one your story could be completely different for somebody else what you're sharing. And that's a really good point. It's not just like cookie cutter, do the TED talk and repurpose that 20 times and share it the same way. Sure, you can repurpose it, but know who you're speaking with and in front of and for and what you want their takeaway to be. I think sometimes when you come from the takeaway and go
Mhm.
backwards, then you can really tailor things a little differently too. All right.
Yeah.
So we're going to play a little game. What I'll do is I'm going to throw out a word and you just come back with the first word that comes to mind. We're doing a word association on this rapid fire.
Ooh, I feel like I'm going to be judged, but also
Nope.
like
No
we're going to have a lot of
perfection,
fun.
Kimberly. Let down that perfect chicky monkey. Okay, here we go. Are you ready?
Perfect chicky monkey.
Here we go. Forgiveness,
Help,
support,
love,
heal,
togetherness,
hero,
relationship,
trauma,
healthy.
crown.
Me.
Yeah, girl. Queen,
Me again.
podcasting.
Voice.
Oh, I'm going to end it right there because that could be so many different things, right? Like how you share your voice.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, on that note, what are some final thoughts that you would like to share with holistically speaking listeners on how to share that voice and how to really just be who you are?
Your authentic story matters. Like, it deeply matters that you are able to get to a point of getting real fast. Podcasts are not the space to air out unhealed trauma. So, if you feel like you have healed certain spaces of your life and you feel like you're comfortable sharing that with people who are in your proximity, friends or family, then that's a space to kind of test out, okay, maybe I'm okay with sharing this with a wider audience. But being able to free yourself of the shame, because shame loves secrets,
Mm.
and look at what are the secrets that you would like to hide. And this is very different, though. I want to be very clear that this is very different than what you keep private.
Mhm.
And there are certain things about my kids, about my family, that I keep relatively private. Like, I don't make them public facing either as a part of my brand. Sometimes with my private clients, I may share something
Mhm.
specific that's correlated to an experience. Not everything in your experience, nor do I think everything in your experience can be correlated to your own personal brand, because nobody will fully know you. And sometimes when we're still learning ourselves at that. So allowing yourself to be present with where you're at, with your authenticity, with where you're at, and also knowing that your authentic self can change.
Mhm.
And so the version of who you have been, you are not beholden to that. You are a person before you are a brand, and letting who you are presently now be enough as you are to serve exactly who needs to hear your message now, so that they can take the next best steps in their life
Mm.
as you do yours.
Amazing. I felt like you were talking to me. Like I need a reminder too. No matter how much work I
Yeah.
do or what I do, like truly, we all battle something where in the moment we're feeling our own feels, right? And I'm sitting there, I'm like, okay, motivational speaker, Hilary needed a reminder. Also to get off my ass and finish my damn book, right?
Finish your damn book, girl. Let me be an early reader. I want to read it and I'll give you a testimonial.
Hoorah! I love it. I adore you. I'm so excited to see you, and well, any chance I get, but more than just share an Uber back from a podcasting conference. But I'm looking forward to just giving you a big hug and just seeing this book grow. And again, we're going to share everything about Make Every Podcast Want You and about Kimberly in the notes. And such a joy seeing you. And thank you for being here. And let's celebrate International Podcast Day.
Yay! Get your voices heard.
Yes, my dear. Thank you. Are you ready to make every podcast want you? Are you prepared to be so radically interesting, as Kimberly says, that you'll want to interview yourself? Then you need to connect with Kimberly and grab a copy of her book, which drops on September 30th, which we already mentioned is International Podcast Day. And here's a little something extra for you that we actually talked about after we stopped pressing record here. I'll be joining Kimberly live on September 30th to celebrate Podcast Day and her book, along with other globally top-rated podcasters just like myself that you are going to want to know. Links to all of the goodies are in the notes of this episode. And we talked a lot about sharing our stories, right? Turning those traumas into triumphs during this conversation. If you need support on your emotional well-being, reach out to me. Let's hug it out and let's do it for your health. You can even join me during a Havening happy hour. I hold them once a month. They are completely free. This is my gift to you. And you'll learn during that hour how to self-regulate and self-soothe for self-care. And the details to register are also in the podcast notes. Of course, this episode, if it touched, moved, inspired you in any way, give us some love by sharing this with someone else. Tell somebody about this episode. And while you're at it, just leave a rating and review just so we know how we're doing here. And also, it just lets others know that this episode and this podcast, Holistically Speaking, exists. Holistically Speaking is edited by Two Market Media, with music by Lipbone Redding and tuned into by you. I'm so grateful for your support. Listen, you have a story in you. Don't doubt it for a second. Share it, declare it. It could make a difference in just one life. And never forget that I love you, I believe in you, and I am sending hugs your way. Be well.
I know the girl with mountains